kicked my spoiled son out to live with my tough-love brother. He struggled, got a job, learned responsibility, changed his life, moved out on his own, and now he finally understands why I did it. I never thought I'd be the kind of father who would kick his own son out of the house. But here I am, sitting in the quiet of my now slightly more peaceful home, wondering if I made the right choice. My son, Jake, is 19, and when I say he's spoiled, I don't mean in a he's a little entitled kind of way. I mean in a full-blown, refuses to get a job, treats the house like a hotel, expects everyone to cater to him, while contributing absolutely nothing kind of way. It wasn't always like this. As a kid, he was bright, funny, and had all the potential in the world. But somewhere along the way, maybe after years of me and his mother trying to give him the best of everything, he turned into someone who thought life should just be handed to him on a silver platter. At first, I excused it. He's young. I told myself when he quit his part-time job after 2 weeks because it was too boring. He'll figure it out. I thought when he dropped out of community college because he didn't vibe with the professors. But after a year of him doing absolutely nothing, no job, no school, just sitting in his room gaming, sleeping till 2 p.m., and somehow managing to have the audacity to complain when we didn't stock his favorite brand of soda, I hit my breaking point. It all came to a head last week when my brother Dan came over for dinner. Dan and I had very different upbringings, despite being raised by the same parents. I was the golden child, good grades, straight to college, responsible. Dan? Let's just say he took the scenic route through life. He got into trouble, barely graduated high school, and spent his 20s bouncing between jobs before finally straightening himself out. Over dinner, Dan casually asked Jake, "So, what are you up to these days?" Jake, without missing a beat and without a shred of shame, said, "Nothing really. Just chilling." Dan laughed, thinking he was joking. When he realized Jake was dead serious, he looked at me like, "Are you kidding me?" I don't know what it was. Maybe seeing my own brother's disappointment, or maybe the sheer absurdity of my grown son being proud of doing nothing. But I lost it. I snapped. I told Jake that he had exactly 1 month to get a job or enroll in school. No exceptions. No excuses. He smirked and said, "Yeah, right." That was it. That was the moment. I stood up, pointed to the door, and said, "You've got 48 hours to pack your stuff. You're going to live with Uncle Dan." Dan, to his credit, didn't even blink. He just nodded and said, "Pack your bags, kid." Jake lost it. He called me a terrible father, said I was ruining his life, said I owed him more time to figure things out. But I was done. My wife, bless her heart, cried a little but ultimately agreed. It was time for Jake to grow up. Dan's got a different way of handling things. He told Jake the second he got to his place, "You don't work, you don't eat." He got Jake a job the next day at a construction site he manages. Jake tried to quit after a few days, but Dan just laughed and said, "Cool. Then you can find your own food and rent." It's been 3 weeks. And you know what? Jake's still there. He's working. Complaining? Absolutely. But working. So, am I a bad person for kicking him out? Maybe. But if being a bad person means forcing my son to finally take some responsibility for his life, then so be it. About a week after Jake moved in with Dan, my wife and I got our first phone call. It was Jake. "You're seriously just going to leave me here?" he whined. "Yep," I said. "How's work?" "It sucks. I'm exhausted. My back hurts. My boss is a jerk." "That's life, kid." Silence. Then, "Can I come home now?" I almost laughed. "No. You've got a roof over your head, food to eat, and a job. Sounds like you're doing just fine." He muttered something under his breath and hung up. Dan called me an hour later, laughing. "Your kid just tried to stage a walkout because I wouldn't let him sleep in past 6. I told him he could either show up on time or start paying rent. He grumbled, but he's at work." Dan's tough love approach was working, and I started noticing subtle changes. Jake stopped calling for little things like, "Can you send me money for a haircut?" Or, "Can you DoorDash me dinner?" He was still miserable, but he was handling it. He learned that if he wanted something, he had to work for it. Then, 2 months in, something happened. Jake called, not to complain, but to talk. "Dad," he said, sounding tired but different. "I get it now." "Get what?" "How hard it is." "Like just living. Paying for stuff. Getting up every morning when you don't want to. It sucks, but I don't know. I think I needed this. I didn't say much, just let him talk. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't acting like the world owed him something. He was starting to understand. Fast forward another month. My wife and I went to visit him at Dan's place. I was expecting the same moody, resentful kid, but the guy who opened the door wasn't the Jake I knew. He'd lost some weight. His posture was better. He wasn't wearing stained sweatpants and a hoodie, just jeans and a plain t-shirt. His hands were rough, and he looked tired, but there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years, pride. Dan clapped him on the back. "Tell your dad what you did." Jake shrugged, looking a little embarrassed. "I got promoted." To be clear, this was the same kid who once quit a job because they asked him to show up on time. Now, he was putting in extra hours, learning new skills, earning his way. I didn't hug him. I knew he'd just roll his eyes, but I patted his shoulder. "Proud of you, kid." That night, as my wife and I drove home, she turned to me and said, "I think we did the right thing." And for the first time, I knew without a doubt, we did. A few more months passed, and Jake kept surprising me. Dan called me one evening. "Your kid just bought a used truck." I nearly dropped my phone. "Jake? With his own money?" "Yup, cash." Said he was tired of bumming rides and wanted to be independent. I had to sit down. My son, the same kid who used to act like walking to the fridge was too much effort, had saved up money, his own money, and made an adult decision. I didn't call him right away. I wanted him to reach out first. And sure enough, 2 days later, he texted me a picture of his truck. "Jake, not bad, huh?" "Me, looks great." "Who paid for it?" "Jake." "Me." "Me. Proud of you." "Jake, thanks." Uncle Dan helped me haggle. I could have cried. Not only was he working, he was learning. He had stopped looking for shortcuts and started figuring things out. But the real shocker came about 6 months after he left home. One day, he called and asked if we could meet for lunch. No complaints, no passive-aggressive jabs, just, "Hey, Dad, want to grab a burger?" So, we met at a diner. I half expected him to ask for money or some kind of favor. Instead, he sat down, looked me in the eye, and said, "I want to come home." I put down my coffee. "Why?" Jake sighed. "Not because I want to go back to how things were. I think I'm ready. I'd pay rent, help around the house. I just miss you and Mom." For the first time in a long time, I saw my son as a man. I nodded. "If you come home, it's different this time. You're an adult now. You help with bills, chores, everything." "I know," he said. "I want to." So, Jake moved back in, but this time, it wasn't a free ride. He paid rent, bought his own groceries, and actually contributed. The kid who once treated our house like a hotel was now waking up early, fixing things around the house, and even, brace yourself, offering to cook dinner sometimes. One night, as we sat at the kitchen table, I asked him, "Do you hate me for kicking you out?" He shook his head. "No, I needed it. If you hadn't, I'd probably still be in my room playing video games, waiting for life to happen." I smiled. "And now?" Jake grinned. "Now, I'm making it happen." I never wanted to be the dad who kicked his kid out. But if I hadn't, I wouldn't have the son I do today. Sometimes the hardest thing you can do for someone you love is let them struggle. A year after I kicked Jake out, something happened that made me realize just how much he had changed. It was a Saturday morning, and I was out in the garage fixing a leaky pipe. I heard the unmistakable sound of Jake's truck pulling into the driveway. He wasn't supposed to be home for a visit, so I figured he was just stopping by for something. "Hey, Dad," he said, stepping inside. "What's up?" I asked, wiping my hands on a rag. Jake hesitated for a second, then said, "I need some advice." I almost laughed. My son, the same kid who used to act like I was some clueless old man, was now asking me for advice. "All right," I said, leaning against the workbench. "Lay it on me." Jake sighed. "There's this guy at work, lazy as hell, always tries to get out of stuff, complains about everything, and still expects to get paid like the rest of us." I smirked. "Sound familiar?" Jake rolled his eyes. Yeah, I get it. I used to be that guy." He ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated. "But it's different when you're the one actually working hard. Now I see how annoying it is." I nodded. "So, what do you want to do about it?" He exhaled. "I don't know. Part of me wants to just ignore it, but another part of me wants to say something to my boss." I don't want to be that guy who tattles, but it's starting to piss me off. I gave him a look. So, you care about your job? Of course I do, he said, like it was obvious. Then he caught himself and smirked. Wow, never thought I'd say that, huh? No. We talked it through, and by the end of the conversation, Jake had decided to let his work speak for itself. I'll just keep doing my thing, he said. If the guy slacks off long enough, the boss will notice. And I thought to myself, damn, he's really growing up. But the real full-circle moment came about 6 months later, when Jake came over for dinner and casually mentioned something that nearly knocked me out of my chair. I'm thinking about getting my own place. My wife and I exchanged glances. Really? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Yeah, Jake said, poking at his mashed potatoes. I mean, I like being home, but I feel like it's time. I've been saving up, and Uncle Dan has been helping me look at apartments. Nothing fancy, but you know something that's mine? I sat back, nodding slowly. That's a big step. I know, Jake said, but I want to do it right this time. That hit me. This time. He knew. He knew that before, when he was just wasting time and taking everything for granted, he wasn't actually living. He was just existing. Now, he wanted to live. A few months later, we helped him move into his own small but decent apartment. He paid for everything himself, deposit, furniture, even a cheap coffee table he found at a garage sale, and refinished himself. As we stood in his new living room, surrounded by boxes, Jake looked around and exhaled. Feels good. I clapped him on the back. It should. You earned it. Jake grinned. Thanks, Dad, for, kicking my ass when I needed it. I chuckled. Anytime, kid. Watching him stand there, confident, independent, and finally ready for life, I knew I had done the right thing. And if I ever start doubting myself, all I have to do is remember the kid who once refused to even take out the trash, now standing in his own home, ready to take on the world. A few months after Jake moved into his new place, he invited us over for dinner. That alone was shocking. This was the same kid who used to roll his eyes anytime we asked him to help set the table. And now he was voluntarily hosting us? My wife was so excited you'd think he had just won an award. We showed up to his apartment, expecting, I don't know, frozen pizza or maybe takeout. Instead, we walked into the smell of actual home-cooked food. Jake was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something that smelled like garlic and butter. What the hell is this? I asked, half joking. Pasta, he said, like it was no big deal. Uncle Dan taught me how to make it. Dan, of course. That man had truly worked miracles. We sat down at Jake's tiny, slightly wobbly dining table, and he served us a simple but solid meal. Pasta with homemade sauce, garlic bread, and even a side salad. My wife looked like she was about to cry. This is delicious, honey, she said. Jake shrugged. It's nothing fancy. Yeah, but you made it, I pointed out. He smirked. You guys did always say I'd have to learn how to feed myself eventually. After dinner, we sat in his small but cozy living room. There were no fancy decorations, just a few framed photos, one of him and some coworkers, one of him and Dan, and then, to my surprise, a picture of our family. I stared at it for a second. Didn't think you'd actually put up a family photo. Jake laughed. Yeah, well, turns out I kind of like you guys. My wife squeezed his hand, beaming. We like you too, sweetheart. Then, as if he wasn't already determined to shock me, Jake leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said, So I've been thinking about going back to school. I almost choked on my drink. School? He nodded. Yeah, not full-time or anything. Just a class or two to start. I figure if I want to move up at work, I should probably get some kind of degree or certification. I didn't know what to say. Just a year ago, this kid had acted like work, responsibility, and life in general were optional. And now he was planning for his future? My wife squeezed my leg under the table, probably sensing that I was about to get emotional. I cleared my throat. That's a great idea, Jake. Yeah, he asked like he wasn't sure. Yeah, I said. And listen, if you ever need help, financially or just advice, you know we're here. Jake nodded, looking down at his hands. I appreciate that, but I want to do it on my own. I mean, I'll probably call you for advice, but I don't want handouts. I smiled. Good. But just so you know, I'd be happy to help because you're trying, not because you're expecting it. He nodded again. I get that now. That moment hit me harder than anything else. Because he really did get it. He wasn't just going through the motions. He truly understood what it meant to be independent, to work for something, to build his own life. And I realized something, sitting there in my son's apartment, eating pasta that he had made with his own hands. I didn't just kick my son out. I gave him a chance to become the man he was always meant to be. And for that, I'd never regret a thing. A year after Jake moved out, something happened that truly cemented the fact that he was no longer the same spoiled kid I had kicked out of my house. It was a regular Saturday afternoon, and I was in the backyard fixing the fence when my phone rang. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and checked the caller ID. It was Jake. Jake, hey Dad. You busy? Me. Just fixing up the fence. What's up? He hesitated for a second. Can I come over? That was new. Usually, if Jake was coming by, he'd text last minute or just show up. But this time he was asking. That alone told me something was different. Of course, I said. Everything okay? Yeah, just need to talk. Half an hour later, Jake pulled into the driveway. And when he got out of his truck, I immediately knew something big was going on. He looked nervous. Not in the I'm about to ask for money way. No, this was something else. We sat down on the back porch, and he ran a hand through his hair, sighing. Dad, he said, I got offered a promotion. Now, normally, this would be cause for celebration. But the way he said it, it wasn't excitement. It was uncertainty. That's great, I said. But you don't look happy about it. It's not that, he said quickly. I mean, I'm happy. It's just the job is in another city. That caught me off guard. Another city? He nodded. A couple hours away. More money, better position, but I'd have to move. Ah, there it is. For the first time in his life, Jake was at a crossroads where he had to make a real adult decision. Not one I was forcing him into, not one Uncle Dan was tough loving him through. This was his choice. I leaned back in my chair. So, what's stopping you? He exhaled. I guess I just got used to being close to home again. I like coming over for dinner, grabbing a beer with Uncle Dan, having you guys around. If I move, it's like he trailed off. It's like you're really on your own. I finished for him. Jake nodded. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, Jake, do you remember what you told me when you moved into your first apartment? He frowned, thinking, not really. You told me it felt good because it was yours. Jake blinked. You worked for it, you earned it, and you built something of your own. This is just the next step, kid. It's scary, sure, but that's what growth feels like. He stared at the ground for a while, then finally looked up at me. So, you think I should take it? I smirked. I think you already know you should take it. Jake sighed, but this time it was different. Lighter. Like the weight of the decision had settled in, and he was ready for it. A week later, he officially accepted the job. A month after that, we were standing outside his new apartment, this time in a whole new city. Dan and I helped him move in, hauling boxes, setting up furniture, cracking jokes the whole time. But when it came time for us to leave, I saw it on Jake's face. For the first time in a long time, he was the one struggling with the goodbye. I clapped a hand on his shoulder. You got this, kid. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. Thanks, Dad. And just like that, my son, the same kid I had once kicked out of my house, was stepping into his own future. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. And that, more than anything, told me I had done the right thing. A few months after Jake moved to his new city, life settled into a new rhythm. He called every weekend, not because he needed anything, but just to talk. Sometimes it was about work, sometimes about a show he was watching, and other times it was just to catch up on family gossip. One Sunday evening, I was sitting on the porch with my wife when my phone rang. It was Jake. Hey, Dad, he said, sounding different. Lighter. Happier. What's up, kid? Just got back from a long day, he said, but I wanted to say thanks. I frowned. For what? For everything, he said. For kicking me out. For making me figure it out. For not letting me waste my life. I sat there, staring out at the yard, letting those words sink in. Jake, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I didn't do any of that for you. I did it because I knew you could do it. You just needed to see it for yourself. He was quiet for a moment. Then he chuckled. You always got to make things sound deep. Damn right, I said, smiling. A few weeks later, Jake came home for a visit. When he pulled up in his truck, I noticed something new, a confidence in the way he carried himself, a sense of purpose. That night, as we sat around the dinner table, he leaned back in his chair and grinned. You know, Uncle Dan's been asking me to come help out at the job site next weekend. Oh, yeah. I raised an eyebrow. Yeah, he said. Figured I'd go. You want to come? I laughed. You inviting me to work? Jake smirked. Hey, you're always saying a man should keep busy. My wife laughed, shaking her head. Look at the two of you. I looked at my son, this grown, independent, capable man sitting across from me. And for the first time, I didn't see the boy I had kicked out of my house. I saw a man who had built himself from the ground up. I raised my glass to figuring it out. Jake clinked his glass against mine, to living it. And for the first time in a long time, I knew without a doubt that I hadn't just done the right thing. I had given my son the greatest gift a father could give, the chance to stand on his own 2 feet. And damn was I proud.